Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Just My Stupid Opinion. I'm Adrian Lloyd. So there's a couple things that I wanted to discuss with all of you today. A few things over the last week that has really driven me insane as I've been forced to watch them. And the big one was when I started to hear about this idea of a pandemic amnesty. And this was an article that was written in The Atlantic sometime within the last week, October 31st, 2022. And it's by Emily Oster saying, "Let's declare a pandemic amnesty. Let's focus on the future and fix the problems we still need to solve." Now, obviously on the surface, when I hear something like this, my first impression is that these are people who are denying their involvement with how people have been treated over the last almost 3 years now. And the thing is that really drives me insane when I hear this sort of thing is the fact that people are starting to say things like we need to move on, we need a pandemic amnesty, all these things, when there hasn't been a single apology for the way people were treated. Because the thing is about all this is she's not actually saying that there should be apologies for the way people were treated. She's just saying that we need to move on from how people are treated. And even in this, she even outlines how crazy some of the people have acted. And let's be clear on something. She's not doing this as an outside observer to say, I've been observing the way people have been treated. She has treated people this way. And instead of owning up to what they did, instead of trying to atone for their mistakes and their unspeakable behavior, they just want to move past it. So it goes on to say, in April 2020, with nothing else to do, my family took an enormous number of hikes. We all wore cloth masks that I had made myself. We had a family hand signal with the person in the front who would use it if someone was approaching on the trail and we needed to put on our masks. Once, when another child got too close to my then 4-year-old son on a bridge, he yelled at her social distancing. This is a behavior that would have been learned from the parents. In no way before would a kid have said something like this, or behaved like this, or treated another kid like this. Not saying that kids can't be nasty to each other, but something like this is something that she instilled in her kid. She beat that into his head in order for him to do something like that. These precautions were totally misguided. In April 2020, no one got the coronavirus for passing someone else hiking. Outdoor transmission was vanishingly rare. Our cloth masks made out of old bandanas wouldn't have done anything anyway. But the thing is, we didn't know. I do not accept this answer because this is another thing that I've been hearing for a long time, that people want to act like none of this information we were aware of early on. Maybe a lot of this information wasn't aware in, say, January of 2020. But within a few months, some things should be made perfectly clear. And one thing that I will never accept someone to say is when it comes to the masks and how effective they are. Because there are studies about how effective masks are that go back quite a long time. There's some that go back to the early 2000s. I know one I looked at was about 10 years old when it was talking about the SARS outbreak that was in Toronto. There was one with that. There was another one from probably around the same time period, maybe a little bit before, which analyzed how effective masks were in stopping the transmission of the common cold and the flu, in which they found that the difference between those who wore masks and who didn't wear masks was basically negligible. So people who wore masks, they did get it less frequently. They did get the flu and the cold less frequently. But out of, just going off my memory, out of the test subject of about 1,000 apiece, 1,000 who wore the mask, 1,000 who didn't, it was maybe a few dozen difference. So not in the grand scheme of things. And even when it came, again, talking about these masks, when we looked at them, most people would be wearing the cloth masks over the surgical masks. And the surgical masks were more effective at preventing the transmission. I think one reason is because cloth masks the cloth masks, they have the hole between the materials, which was big enough for a virus molecule to get through. So that's why it made them not very effective, as well as the paper masks were one piece of paper. And that, and the fact that surgical masks are disposable, so people would be wearing them less. Because the thing was, too, is with these masks, is that there was a very big buildup of bacteria all around the mouth and nose because people were breathing into them so much. So this idea that we didn't know is, you can't claim ignorance. In the age of information, ignorance is a choice. And this is exactly what a lot of these people did, because there were many people out there who were talking about these studies. There were many people out there that were linking to these studies. There were many people that were trying to get this message across, but people were not listening to it. In fact, they vehemently pushed back against anyone who said this sort of thing. It was because they wanted to feel safe. And even if that was a placebo effect, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the fact that they felt safe and they felt secure. And so you can't claim you didn't know, because all the information is right out there. And this is the thing with COVID and everything that we dealt with, is this information has been out there for a long periods of time. People were trying to get the message out to everyone that they could, but it was being pushed back on. And not just pushed back on, people were getting banned off social media if they ever tried to actually share this stuff. Anyway, it goes on. I have been reflecting on this lack of knowledge thanks to a class I'm co-teaching at Brown University on COVID. We spent several lectures reliving the first years of the pandemic, discussing the many important choices we had to make under conditions of tremendous uncertainty. Some of these choices turned out better than others. To take an example close to my own work, there is an emerging, if not universal, consensus that schools in the U.S. were closed for too long. The health risks of in-school spreads were relatively low, whereas the cost of students' well-being and education and progress were high. The latest figures on learning loss are alarming. And we're going to be covering that soon, because that was the other thing I wanted to talk about. But the thing was, again, when it came to this, what we're talking about here is that, once again, you cannot claim we didn't know, because even the CDC and the World Health Organization were putting out the numbers of your chances of recovering for COVID. And if you were in the 0 to 18 or 19 bracket, you were fine. It was basically, there are a few rare cases where people did die from COVID who were in that bracket, but it was exceedingly rare. In fact, it was pretty rare right up until you got, I'm going off memory again, so I might be a little bit off, but I think when you got somewhere between the 50 to 60 mark. Before then, you were looking at a 99% recovery rate. So basically, from somewhere 50 and younger, you were fine. And then above there is where the numbers started to drop a little bit about that. I think then it went down to 98%. Basically, it never dropped below 92% recovery rate, and that was only after you reached the 85 and over mark. So the extremely elderly, who already are susceptible to a lot of these diseases, like even before COVID, we would talk about how the flu season was a scary time for nursing homes because it just rampages through there and it takes lives. So when they're talking about shutting down the schools and like, oh, we didn't know that, there wouldn't be a spread in transmission, even if there was, the students were not at risk. I mean, the teachers, is depending on their age, you can make that argument. But what we ended up doing to children and their education is extremely damaging. Kids are so far behind now because we ended up shutting them out of schools, and not just shutting them out of schools. We shut them out of schools, and many parents wouldn't let them see their friends. There was no socializing. You hear some parents talking about how their kids were born when everyone had masks on, so now there's this social anxiety that's being bred into kids from the day that they are born. There's mental illnesses that are on a rise. There are self-harm that was on the rise. There was drug use that was on a rise. all with children because of what we ended up doing to them. And that's why I think that is the biggest sin that we ever did in this whole COVID thing, is the way that we just threw the younger generations under the bus. These are kids who are relying on adults to keep them safe, to lead them in the right direction, because they're too young to make these decisions for themselves. And we absolutely failed them. We absolutely failed these kids with what we ended up doing. And many of the people, many of the adults, did this because they wanted to feel safe. It was an extremely selfish act in where kids, their futures, their abilities to grow socially, their abilities to grow mentally, all that was thrown to the side so some adults could feel comfortable, so some adults could feel safe. This is what it boils down to. They'll use all sorts of terminology like, well, we needed to stop the spread, flatten the curve, whatever they want. Fact of the matter is, this is what they're really doing. It's because they were scared. These adults were scared, so these kids had to suffer. And we're going to take a look at that in a little bit. But in the spring of summer 2020, we only had glimmers of information. By then, there was enough information out that we knew how to proceed. Truly, we knew how to proceed. There were still some variables on there, but it wasn't the Black Plague as everyone was acting like it was. It was... People were acting as if COVID was something that if you got it, it was pretty much like saying nice knowing you to people. Like a 35-year-old man gets it, perfectly healthy, and you know what? It's been nice knowing you. I'll say some nice things at your funeral. By then, we could even see where the numbers were. Reasonable people who cared about children and teachers, advocated on both sides of the reopening debate. Another example, when vaccines came out, we lacked definitive data on the relative efficacies of the Johnson & Johnson shot versus the mRNA option from Pfizer and Moderna. The mRNA vaccine had won out, but at the time, some people in public health were either neutral or expressed a J&J preference. This misstep wasn't nefarious. It was a result of uncertainty. I mean, there's a lot we could say about the vaccines itself. I think the defining factor as to how effective it could be or how safe it could be was how fast it was pushed through production with few to no trial periods, no long-term research that was done, and the fact that these companies were not prepared to take responsibility if people were harmed or killed because of their product. So I think there was enough there said to at least cast suspicion down upon the vaccine, if nothing else. Obviously, some people intended to mislead and made wildly irresponsible claims. Remember when public health community had spent a lot of time and resources urging Americans not to inject themselves with bleach? That was bad. Misinformation was and remains a huge problem, but most errors were made by people who are working in earnest for the good of society. We could go into a lot of doctors being bought off by drug companies in order to push their products, but yes, there were people who had good intentions, who were just wrong. Given the amount of uncertainty, almost every position was taken on every topic, and on every topic, someone was eventually proven right, and someone else was proven wrong. In some instances, the right people were right for the wrong reasons. In other instances, they had a prescient understanding of available information. Basically, the more and more this article goes on... Oh, fuck off, Atlantic. I'm not paying for your shit. basically, it goes on to say we have to put these fights aside and declare a pandemic amnesty. We can leave out the willful purveyors of actual misinformation while forgiving the hard calls that people had no choice but to make with imperfect knowledge. Los Angeles County closed its beaches in summer 2020. Ex post facto, this makes no more sense than my family masked hiking trips, but we need to learn from our mistakes and then let them go. We need to forgive the attacks too. We need to forgive the attacks too. You know, it just reminds me how the other day, during Tamara Litch's testimony in front of the Emergency Act Commission, some clips got posted online, and comments were made on both sides about people who supported her, people who were against her. But I remember one person ended up saying that, how the unvaxxed, we were in a different boat compared to everyone else. And someone else replied basically saying that, no, we were all in the exact same boat. The convoy was being antisocial and selfish. Now, in certain regards, in dealing with the general bullshit that came with COVID, you could say that we were in the same boat. And a lot of times we all were. But that has so far shifted that nobody should dare ever say that we are in the same boat. Because the people who went out and got the vaccine, they didn't have to put up with a lot of what the rest of us had to put up with. Many people got it not because they wanted to get it, but they felt forced into getting it. Many people got it so that way they could see relatives. Many people got it because they were scared about losing their jobs and being able to support their families. And many of those people feel betrayed. They feel screwed over because of it. But there are many others who were so dogmatic in the way that they were going about this that they didn't care if they became the type of people that they hated. And you could see this with the way that they talked about people who didn't get the vaccine and what they pushed for. In my last video I put out, where's your empathy? I ended up outlining a lot of this about what you came at us for. All we wanted was to make our own decisions. We wanted to be left alone. We knew what was best for us, and we wanted to leave you alone so you can make those decisions. But you didn't. These people didn't, and they did everything they can to make our lives living hells. They started off trying to bribe us, show your, go get the shot, and then you can have a free donut from Dunkin' Donuts or Krispy Kreme or whatever. Oh, you can go get yourself a free burger and fries. You can get put into a lottery. You can go and have dinner with your favorite celebrity, possibly, if you end up getting chosen from this selected lottery. Or win $1 million. There was all these things that they were trying to do to bribe people. And when the bribes didn't work, they went to threats. Well, now we're going to come after you. Well, you're not going to be able to work. Which is literally the end result of that is people hungry and homeless. That is their kids hungry and homeless. Kids was another one. Many people were saying that people who didn't get vaccinated and didn't get their kids vaccinated, that they should have their kids taken away. So the jobs taken away, their kids taken away, have to pay for their own health care, even though, at least in this country, we pay it through our tax. Many people in countries like America have health insurance that they pay for, but apparently that was supposed to be taken away. Rejected from society. So they did all this. They wouldn't leave us alone and tried to make these decisions for us. And then in a comment like whatever this woman made, she says it was antisocial and selfish. They rejected us from society and then are surprised of antisocial behavior. They went around for 2 years being the most selfish human beings on the planet, and they're surprised that when the people that they've been going after have their own selfish behavior. So when they say enough of the attacks, this is not proportionate, because one side received a hell of a lot more attacks, a hell of a lot more nasty behavior being directed towards them, a hell of a lot more nasty end results that are being threatened with. And there's never been an apology for this. They may say, oh yeah, we were wrong in certain things, but have you ever gotten I'm sorry for the way that we treated you? I'm sorry for what you had to go through? I've never seen one. Not one. And they're coming to us now, asking for our forgiveness. I have no intention of giving that forgiveness to them. And I honestly don't think anyone else should. I know that especially for, say, Christians, that's not a very Christian thing to do, so you make that decision for yourself if that's what you want to do. But some behavior is inexcusable. Some behavior is unforgivable. And I think a lot of the ways these people behaved was unforgivable and inexcusable. And they just want to go back to the way things were. It doesn't happen that way. You better be prepared to make huge amends if you want to go back to the way things were. Because one side got a few scrapes and bruises, the other side was beaten into the ground. And the people who beat the unvaxxed into the ground as hard as they could, tried to ruin their lives, tried to split up their families, tried to take everything special away from them, are the ones saying, no hard feelings, right? It's unacceptable, and I don't think they should ever be left off the hook until they've made real amends, at least. And even at that point, you can do what you want. I don't think I'm ever going to be there. So it says, we need to forgive the attacks too, because I thought schools should reopen and argue that kids as a group were not at high risk. I was called a teacher killer and a genocider, I guess it was. It wasn't pleasant, but feelings were high, and I certainly don't need to dissect and rehash that time for the rest of my days. Moving on is crucial now because the pandemic created many problems that we still need to solve. Student test scores have shown a historic decline, more so in math than in reading, and more so for students who were disadvantaged at the start. We need to collect data, experiment, and invest. Is high-dosage tutoring more or less effective than extended school years? Why have some states recovered faster than others? We should focus on questions like these because answering them is how we will help our children recover. It's going to be a long process for a lot of these kids to recover. Because what we all knew was coming, massive learning setbacks show COVID's sweeping tolls on kids. A new analysis found that the average student lost more than half a school year of learning in math and nearly a quarter of a school year in reading. And I think that might be a conservative estimate. And I think the thing that is not being addressed by this is students' behavior now. I think you've probably seen a huge backstep with behavioral problems in a lot of students. A lot of these social skills that they are learning, especially from a very young age, they've lost that. They've lost that now because of what ended up happening. And the other thing I don't like, and I've heard this time and time again, is this where people say it's COVID's sweeping toll on kids, or COVID shut down the economy, or COVID did this, COVID did that. It was not COVID. It was the government. It was the government who shut things down. They shut down the economy. They shut down schools. They put people out of work. They may have given you $2,000 a month, but even then, afterwards, there were plenty of people. They found small loopholes to say, oh, well, actually, you've got to pay this money back. you actually didn't, you took it for a little too long, you actually didn't meet all the criteria, even though we put you out of work, so you actually have to pay back all of your CERB money that you took. Things like this. It was the government that did that. It was conservative provincial governments across Canada, and it was the Liberal federal government. A lot of this was done by the provincial governments, but it was also one of those where the federal government basically said, you do this or we're going to do this. And I find that a lot of these provincial governments, a lot of these premiers took the bait because it made them look like the bad guy then. That was the thing with a lot of the mask mandates. That was the thing with the vaccine passports. A lot of that was done at the provincial level, but a lot of that was also under threat by the Liberal government. I don't, however, consider Ontario in the same light as that, though. Doug Ford has been lockstep with Justin Trudeau when it came to all of COVID. He was just as hypocritical as Trudeau, locking people down and then immediately going to see friends and family or going on vacation. The rules didn't apply to him. Same with Justin Trudeau. I remember early into 2020 during the first lockdown, he ended up going on vacation. He left Ottawa and he went up to his cottage or something while he's saying, "Oh, don't travel. Don't go traveling, guys." And I think, I could be wrong, but I think his cottage is actually in Quebec, which means he was going across province lines when he wasn't supposed to. But it was this hypocrisy. Ford basically became Trudeau's whipping boy, his little bitch. That's who Doug Ford was. And look how that played out for him. Trudeau used him. He used him so hard. He used him like a cheap fucking whore. And then discarded him at the first possible time. You see the way that Trudeau talks about Ford even now, and he doesn't give a shit what Doug Ford did. And fuck that guy. Fuck Doug Ford. That guy does not deserve anyone's fucking support. The shit he has done, the shit he did to people, fuck Doug Ford. I'm glad he got used like a little fucking whore. The wrong Ford died. Doug Ford, I would replace him with Rob Ford in a fucking heartbeat. I was a big 2018 when he first appeared on the scene. Yeah, I pushed hard for him. I pushed hard for Doug Ford. I thought he was going to be what we needed. And it turns out he was the biggest fucking disappointment we've ever seen. The biggest fucking disappointment. Anyway, enough of my tangent. As I was saying, the repercussions from the school closures that we had on kids has been catastrophic. The thing is why I think that these results here, what they're saying, they say that students lost more than half a school year of learning math and a quarter of a school year in reading. The reason I think these are worse is because while they were still doing online learning, it proved to be incredibly ineffective because students weren't there to really feel engaged, so they didn't really pay attention. I'm sure there were many that may have had their webcam on, but were probably playing video games and the sort. But anyway, it says, the COVID-19 pandemic devastated poor children's well-being, not just by closing their schools, but also taking away their parents' jobs, sickening their families and teachers, and adding chaos and fear to their daily lives. The scale of disruption to American kids' education is evident in a district-by-district analysis of test scores shared exclusively with the Associated Press. The data provide the most comprehensive look yet at how much school children have fallen behind academically. So this was a study out of the U.S., but I think that can easily apply to us here in Canada. We're similar enough that I don't think there's going to be much of a difference in the way that it has gone the way it has affected kids, I don't think it's really going to have affected Canadian kids any much worse or much better than it has in America. I think the thing is, too, where it's a little bit different is that, well, where there were states that were opposed to shutting schools and opposed to lockdowns, there were significantly fewer in Canada, significantly fewer provinces, if any at all, that really opposed the lockdown and closing the schools. The analysis found the average student lost more than half a school year of learning in math and nearly a quarter of a school year in reading, with some districts' average slipping by more than double those amounts, or worse. Online learning played a major role, but students lost significant ground even where they returned quickly to schoolhouses, especially math scores in low-income communities. Quote, when you have a massive crisis, the worst effects end up being felt by the people with the least resources, says Stanford educational professor Sean Reardon, who compiled and analyzed the data along with Harvard economist Thomas Kane. Some educators have objected to the very idea of measuring learning loss after a crisis that has killed over 1 million Americans, and that is debatable because, I mean, it's the old fucking meme for those who see it. It's man's parachute fails to open, dies of COVID. They were saying anybody, basically looking for any reason to label someone dead from COVID. And this has been confirmed by many doctors and nurses this long time ago, years ago, in the middle of 2020, this was being seen. If you had the virus in you at all, no matter how much or how little of the virus, and they could detect it, they marked you as a COVID death. So you could have been dying from cancer and died from cancer, but you had COVID in your system, so it was a COVID death. It wasn't cancer, it was COVID that ended up killing you. One of the reasons for this, and probably the biggest reason, was because, especially in the States, and I'm pretty sure it was the same here in Canada, the hospitals that had, the more COVID outbreaks you had in the hospital, the more federal funding you received. And I'm pretty sure state funding too. So it was all about making money. So you got to take this with a grain of salt. There are people that died as a direct result from COVID, but many were just labeled as a COVID death, even if the virus made no impact, made no difference on whether these people died or not. And I can't remember his name, but the creator of the PCR test, he's dead now. I'm pretty sure he's dead now. But he was very critical of how people used his test, because he basically said when it came to the PCR test, and this was something that he criticized Fauci on, Dr. Anthony Fauci on, back during the AIDS crisis. But he basically said that he's misinterpreting the results of the PCR test, and that if you run the PCR test, if you run it long enough, you can find anything in there. You could be perfectly healthy, walking around, no problem, but you have just a trace of, say, the flu in you, and the PCR test will show that up. So that's one of the problems with everything that they have shown, is the fact, everything that they have done with the especially the PCR tests, was the fact that you could basically, someone could be walking around, no chance of spreading it, no chance that they're being sick from it, but they'll test positive. This was also the problem with a lot of the rapid tests early on. I remember there was a politician in Austrian Parliament. I'm pretty sure it was a European politician. It was a while ago. He tested it on a can of Coke, and it came, one of the rapid tests on a can of Coke, and it came back positive. So there's a lot of misdiagnosing, and there's a lot of people who were said to have died of COVID, even though it was not COVID that killed them. So that number is debatable. Reading and math scores don't tell the entire story about what's happening with a child, but they're one of the only aspects of children's development reliably measured nationwide. Quote, test scores aren't the only thing or the most important thing, said Reardon, but they serve as an indicator of how kids are doing. And kids aren't doing well, especially those who were at highest risk before the pandemic. The data shows many children need significant intervention, and advocates and researchers say the U.S. isn't doing enough. So, one of my concerns with all this, too, is the fact that I don't think these kids will ever really be able to come back from this. Not really. Unless they're planning to start holding kids back, holding whole grades back, I don't think there's going to be a really good comeback from this. Because whenever you're this far behind, well, let me use an example in my own personal life. Back in 2017, I was in college. And this was also, for those who remember, this was the time that post-secondary education professors ended up striking. It was all across Ontario. They ended up going on strike for 6 weeks until they were forced back with back-to-work legislation by the Kathleen Wynne government. One second. There we go. So, sorry about that. So they were forced back to work then. But the problem was, though, is that when we got back, even though it was just 6 weeks, we were so far behind. We had to skip a lot in order to just try and catch up for the end of the semester. We had to extend the year because typically it would go up right before Christmas and then you have your exams and done. We ended up skipping our Christmas break and had to go into January. And then basically it was, as soon as that semester was done with the exams and all that, there was like a weekend and you were back at it. So instead of having the normal break you would get, it was a weekend and back into second semester. But there was a lot that got skipped. One of my classes, because I was taking construction engineering technician, one of the classes was it was electricity, plumbing, and HVAC. And we ended up getting almost to the end of our almost to the end when it came to covering our electricity. And we basically skipped over plumbing when we came back. So we got a refresher course on electricity, but a lot of us, it wasn't fresh in the minds anymore. So we kind of suffered because of that. And then we basically skipped over plumbing. Our professor barely spent a week on it. Not because he didn't want to. He was actually a good teacher. I liked him a lot, and I thought he was very good at putting things into layman terms that made it easy to understand. So I actually always found he was a very good teacher, but he didn't have the fucking time. We basically did a little bit on plumbing, had a quick test that was as basic as it got because we barely learned anything, and we were on to HVAC. And a lot of this was true with a lot of everything else that we had to do on our other subjects. That was 6 weeks of striking. We're talking about 2 years or so of schools repeatedly being opened and shut down, doing online learning. And these kids have fallen so far behind that even if we're taking these numbers that I've already said I feel are very conservative numbers, I can definitely see it being way worse. In fact, it even did say that earlier. It said that some areas, those numbers were twice as bad as what they ended up showing. That you can't just come back from that. You can't just come back from it by doing a little bit of an extended year or even glossing over things, because there's a buildup. There's always a buildup when it comes to teaching a little bit more onto something that's a little more complicated, on and on and on. And even when it comes to tutoring, it's going to be a lot more difficult. Who's going to pay for the tutoring? Is that going to have to come out of the parents' own pockets in order to try and get their kids to catch up? Or is that going to be something that is provided by, I guess if we're talking in the case of the states, would it be provided by the state? Would it be provided by the federal government? That's going to cost a lot of money. Not that that really tends to matter for a lot of governments. That means cut into a lot of students' personal time. Extracurricular activities is going to cut into. Many kids do sports, many do music, they do drama and all that. That's got to cut in just so they can learn the basics of reading and mathematics again. You can't just recover from this. You can't just recover from this by a few extra tutors and maybe an extended school year. This is going to require a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of manpower just to try and get all these students caught up. And it's not going to happen because any time something happens on a massive scale like this, it never goes the way that they want. It never goes off so smoothly. So a lot of these kids are going to get left behind because of it. Kids who could have excelled or done well enough for themselves. But that's not going to matter. That's not going to matter later in life. If they're falling behind in every single year, they're more behind than where they're supposed to be. Once they get out of school, I mean, they're going to try and maybe go for a good college or university as an example. I feel like this is just going to, their grades aren't going to reflect how smart these kids can be. And I just think there's going to be a whole generation of kids that are going to have been left behind because of it. And I think it's almost inevitable. They can say that we're going to try and catch these students up, but there's so many, I don't think they ever will be able to catch up, that leaving them behind is basically, that's all that's going to happen. It's all they can do. And it's a shame. It's a shame that these kids have to be left behind because of the piss poor decision of scared adults. Thing is, too, is especially if we're talking about low-income areas, poor children and the like, usually don't live in the best neighborhoods. Doing poorly in school has been one of the prime factors that lead kids to a life on the street, which usually involves drugs, which usually involves crime. It can involve gang involvement, because if they're not feeling they're excelling at school and their life isn't going to go anywhere, they don't see the point of going to school, so they don't. But then they find a group of people that will help them excel, just not in the way that society wants, not the way their parents want, probably not the way that they want. We already had a number of kids who were at risk of this before COVID, and I think you're going to have a whole army of these kids after COVID. But they want to declare a pandemic amnesty. You know what? Didn't matter what happened to you. Didn't matter what you did. Just total forgiveness. Total forgiveness. That's the way it should be approached. Man, in the future, adults, the past generations, are going to have to beg these kids for forgiveness for what we did to them. And these kids should not grant it. Because after what we did, I don't really think that we deserve it. And I'm speaking on a more general basis right now. Obviously, there's people from every single generations, from the baby boomers down to the millennials, who were opposed to this. But speaking on generally across the boomers, Gen X, millennials, all these generations are going to have to beg for the forgiveness of these kids. Because look at the world we're leaving them. Already when it comes to my generation, we can see how a lot of people from my generation aren't going to be able to retire with the way that things are going, with things getting pricier, with wages being stagnant. Many won't own their own homes, so they'll be stuck renting for the rest of their lives. things aren't really affordable, so even basic things like being able to take your family out to a restaurant is suddenly becoming it's suddenly becoming harder and harder. It shouldn't be this difficult, and you shouldn't have to budget yourself just to be able to take your family out to dinner every once in a while. But we're getting to that point. We're getting to the point, too, where people aren't even willing to buy anything for themselves that they really don't need, because that's just money wasted. I remember I was even talking to my neighbor a little while ago, and one thing that I have done, and he was basically saying that he did the same thing, is I used to be a guy that would always just pick up my coffee on my way to work. You know, it was Tim Hortons, McDonald's, whatever. Just go in, pick one up now. And we both talked about how we don't do that anymore. I brew my coffee at home and bring it with me all the time now. And he does the same because, 5 years ago or something, just buying a cup of coffee every single day was nothing. It didn't even factor into your budget. But it's gotten to the point now where you really are sitting there going, do I need to pay for this coffee every single day? Do I need to go out and buy myself some food at the beginning of the day, or should I just make something to bring it with me? Because, Jesus, I mean, even just a couple weeks ago, it was one of the rare times I did go out and buy myself food. I brought my own coffee. I bought 2 breakfast sandwiches from Tim Hortons, $9. This is the point we're at, where it's unattainable to keep just spending money like this. Not with how everything's going up in price. Not to mention, we're having a huge problem with supplies right now. We always seem to be out of just everything. My wife was having trouble finding coffee filters the other day ago. I remember a couple weeks ago, she was just saying there's no eggs. There was no eggs. I mean, that didn't last long, I will say that. It's not like we were out of eggs for weeks or something, but it was just, we couldn't get eggs for a while there. Don't even get started when you're talking about children's medication. Tempra right now is about as valuable as gold because it's just as rare. There's a pharmacy from there's a pharmacy by the corner store by my house. That is, trying to get Tempra there. The guy who works there, who owns it, basically said, I've basically met every single parent in this goddamn neighborhood because everyone's looking for Tempra. I get 1 shipment every few days. That's the point we're at. And things are probably just going to keep getting worse. And this is the world we're going to leave to our kids. You even talk about renting. A 2-bedroom apartment, at least here in Ottawa, is about $1,600 just for 2-bedroom apartment. Even bachelor pads are now well over $1,000 a month for that. Houses, if you're looking to rent, you're looking at over $2,000 a month just to rent a house. And these don't have to be big or nice houses. That's the point we're at. So this is the world that we're leaving for these younger generations. And then on top of that, we screwed up their childhood because a bunch of adults were scared. But we should just have a pandemic amnesty. Just give a pass to everyone. That's all I really got for you all right now. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon, hopefully for another video. I know I'm not exactly the greatest lately at having a proper and decent upload schedule, but I'll try a little bit harder to put out videos. It also depends on what's going on, if I want to talk about it, but I will try and start putting out videos on a regular, but I'm not going to promise because I've made that promise before and have failed. So anyway, take care of yourselves, and hopefully I'll talk to you soon.